Welcome to the Jenna Ellis Show, sponsored by Legacy Precious Metals. There has never been a better time to invest in precious metals. Visit legacypminvestments.com. That's legacypminvestments.com. I'm Jenna Ellis. Join me tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern on the Salem News Channel for Jenna Ellis Tonight, where we will be breaking down the top trending headlines coming out of the RNC convention this week with some significant wins for Donald Trump. Of course, he picked his vice president last night, Senator JD Vance. Carly Atchison, a GOP strategist, is going to join us tonight to break it all down, what everyone is saying about Senator Vance and the excitement over the Trump-Vance ticket. We'll also have our legal eagles join us for commentary on Judge Aileen Cannon's dismissal of the Florida documents case. What does this possibly portend for the DOJ's case out of D.C. and all of the lawfare against Donald Trump? We'll also tackle some very interesting legal philosophy and what you need to know to preserve conservatism to the next generation and beyond. All this and more, 9 p.m. Eastern. Good evening and welcome to Jenna Ellis Tonight. So while all eyes were on JD Vance, who is the vice presidential pick for the Republican ticket, Donald Trump also entered WWE style, as Politico noted, into the RNC convention with that wrap over his ear. And I just felt looked incredibly emotional, and it was an amazing moment last night there on the convention floor. And Trump was also celebrating a very significant win earlier in the day that we really need to discuss, which is the dismissal of the documents case out of Florida. This is the partial opinion coming from Judge Cannon. She says this: former President Trump's motion to dismiss the indictment based on the unlawful appointment and funding of special counsel Jack Smith is granted in accordance with this order. The superseding indictment is dismissed because special counsel Smith's appointment violates the appointments clause of the United States Constitution in Article 2, Section 2. Special counsel Smith's use of permanent indefinite appropriation also violates the appropriations clause. That's in Article 1, Section 9. But the court doesn't even need to address the proper remedy for that funding violation, given the dismissal on the appointment clause grounds. So let's bring in our legal eagles to discuss. Joining me is Josh Hammer, who is the senior editor at large for Newsweek and the host of the Josh Hammer Show, and also Mike Donnelly, who is an attorney and a law professor. And so, Josh, let's start with you. This is a phenomenal win for Donald Trump, who just can't seem to be beat down.
Yeah, it's a tremendous victory for Donald Trump. It is a tremendous rebuke of the Democrat lawfare complex and their leading hitman, the so-called special counsel, Jack Smith. I mean, note that I said so-called special counsel because that's kind of the crux of this ruling, is that he's actually not special counsel. You know, Jenna, many of us have been bleeding about this for frankly, almost a year, honestly. I mean, the indictment in this case dropped in June 2023. Judge Aileen Cannon was randomly assigned from the Southern District of Florida shortly thereafter. But the Constitution is actually very clear. So the Appointments Clause is a two-tier hierarchy between principal officers and inferior officers. So for principal officers under the Article 2 Appointments Clause, that's old school advice and consent, where the president nominates and the Senate confirms. Now, the question the threshold question is whether or not Jack Smith is actually a principal officer, similar to the old independent counsel, Ken Starr from the 1990s, individuals like that. Congress actually let the old independent counsel statute lapse after Justice Anthony Scalia had a blistering dissent in the Morrison versus Olson case and argued persuasively that it was unconstitutional. So when Judge Aileen Cannon first started holding hearings on this very question about a month ago, that was actually first what she was getting at. She was asking Jack Smith, you know, are you actually in communication with Merrick Garland? Is there a chain of command here, or are you purporting to be a principal officer of the United States, in which case the Senate would actually have to confirm? But even if Jack Smith is an inferior officer, not a principal, but an inferior officer, he still has to be appointed quote, by law under the constitutional language. And as Justice Clarence Thomas argued persuasively in his concurring opinion in the Trump immunity case, Trump versus United States 2 weeks ago, Justice Thomas argued that by law, historically, when it comes to someone with a special counsel, means that Congress passes a very specific authorizing statute on the books here. On the contrary, Attorney General Merrick Garland had cited 4 or 5 random statutory subsections deep in the bowels of 28 U.S. code that has to do with the judiciary and DOJ. But none of these citations actually amount to the, quote, by law that the Constitution demands. So tremendous ruling by Judge Cannon. She deserves a ton of credit for having the courage of her convictions to do this in a case of this magnitude. Jack Smith's going to have his appeal at the 11th Circuit, but I think that's ultimately going to stand.
Yeah. And so, Mike, before we get into that appellate process, I want to get your take on something really important that Josh just said, which is that, the DOJ under Merrick Garland seems to just be citing all of these federal statutes, but not really having authority that's rooted in the text of the law. I mean, they did the same thing for a lot of the January 6th cases, and they were just recently beat down by the U.S. Supreme Court. So this seems like it's the typical MO for Merrick Garland's DOJ. Is this a runaway DOJ that just wants to do whatever it wants without really any authorization?
Well, it certainly looks that way to me. And I would say, and thanks, Josh, great breakdown of the case. This is a victory for the Constitution and the rule of law. And I give Judge Cannon great credit, and I hope Trump will put her on his list of appellate appointees, move her up the chain of command. We need people who understand what it means to interpret a statute and then apply it. And that's what happens here. And this casts some doubt on the whole Mueller investigation, right? So that Mueller was appointed similarly. Here's the deal. The Constitution tells you how to appoint U.S. attorneys by law. Congress makes law. And so what I love about what Judge Cannon did, and this should be a message to the rest of the administration, follow the law. Don't just try to hook into these idiosyncratic statutes that seem to give you some authority. Actually ask whether that statute was intended for that purpose. That's a problem we see across the administrative state, which is why I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing from the Supreme Court and from judges like Judge Cannon. They're pushing back. They're saying, no, the Constitution is relevant here. Congress needs to act. And we're not going to let the administrative state just get away with doing whatever it wants. So great ruling, for victory for the Constitution, victory for the rule of law, victory for our country, victory for Donald Trump.
Yeah, and I think that is a very important point to underscore as well, that this is a victory for the U.S. Constitution. It's not just that, as the Democrats and the leftists and mainstream media are saying, that, Aileen Cannon is just in Donald Trump's pocket. No, we always, as conservatives, and especially, as legal practitioners and philosophers, need to make sure that we are always abiding by the rule of law, regardless of the outcome in terms of the parties. That's what's important here. But in terms of how this may affect the DC case now that is being still run by Jack Smith. Josh, will there be, do you think, a motion by Team Trump's lawyers in light of this ruling to at least suspend proceedings there until the appellate case here makes its way up? Because if the Supreme Court says that Jack Smith was unconstitutionally appointed, that necessarily seems like it would affect DC.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if they haven't filed that motion already, then it's something of a formality. I'm sure they probably filed it, frankly, already after the Clarence Thomas concurring opinion in the Trump immunity case. But surely that is forthcoming imminently, if not. Look, if the D.C. case is not quite on its deathbed, it's definitely at least on hospice care. I mean, at least 2 of the 4 charges are those Sarbanes-Oxley Act charges that the court narrowed in the Fisher ruling. Those will be thrown out. The other 2 charges have this massive, is it an official act, is it an unofficial act, this very fact-intensive test here. And then you have this glaring 30,000-foot elephant problem in the room of the question whether Jack Smith was actually legally appointed in the first place. So look, the intellectually honest thing to do for a prosecutor or a so-called prosecutor, as the case may be, like Jack Smith, the intellectually honest thing to do at this point would be to just take your bags and go home. Like, you lost. Maybe you gave it your all. You really didn't give it your all, because Jack Smith had a long time to file these charges. He waited until the year before a presidential election to do so. But he's losing, and he's losing badly. If he wants to continue to throw mud at the wall and see what sticks, I guess he can do so. But again, the D.C. case is not going anywhere. Now, the question is whether Tanya Chutkan will actually reach the same result as Aileen Cannon when it comes to the Appointments Clause issue. I have no particular faith that she will, to be honest with you. She has shown herself to be a pretty anti-Trump judge in the past. She's previously donated to the Biden presidential campaign. I could be wrong, obviously, but I mean, if you play that out even further, then you have the potential, Jenna, for a circuit split potentially in the D.C. Circuit and the 11th Circuit. Therefore, that would head straight to the Supreme Court. The upshot is that from a Trump perspective, there is now zero chance, and I repeat, zero chance that either of these cases is actually going to make it to a full trial prior to November.
Yeah. And so, Mike, just from a sort of 30,000-foot perspective of, this day in American jurisprudence, what's fascinating to me when watching all of this is seeing how much of landmark first impression cases are actually being heard by the U.S. Supreme Court on issues, like presidential immunity that the Supreme Court just hasn't had the opportunity to contemplate. And I think that their opinion came as no surprise to anyone who's actually read the Constitution and who understands how our system of government works. And yet, we're seeing some of these rulings that I think will be a good thing for the next 30 years. I mean, is this maybe a sort of tertiary unintended good consequence of this lawfare?
Well, that's a good question, Jenna. I'm not sure. Bad facts make bad law. And these are politically motivated cases. And I don't think they have particularly great facts for the Democrats. They're manufacturing cases out of laws that were not intended to be used for this purpose in some cases. And they're stretching laws or appointing special counsels who really don't have the authority of the law. So I'm not sure. And I'm glad we're going to be talking about the Trump immunity case, because as Josh mentioned, that ties in here. Judge Cannon cited Clarence Thomas's concurrence, which talked about the constitutionality of the special counsel. So these cases kind of connect with each other. When you politically prosecute people, and I feel like the Dems are getting caught. They had their hopes on trying to tarnish Trump. They tried to kill him, or not they, but someone who's motivated. Well, I guess we don't really know what the motivations of this person was, but they're coming after him, and they deserve some culpability for how they have demonized Donald Trump and caused people like this 20-year-old to take a shot at the president, who miraculously survived. So 4 cases, they're all crumbling under the weight of the lack of evidence and the lack of the law supporting them. I'm not sure, though, and your question's a good one. I'd be interested to hear what Josh thinks. I'm not sure how this bodes for the country going forward. Did the Supreme Court really need to rule on this absolute immunity, this core functions case, which we're going to talk about? I think we need to have a conversation about that, because I'm not sure that's necessarily a great thing.
Well, in 30 seconds, Josh, I'll give you the last crack at that question.
I mean, as far as the presidential immunity case came out, I thought it was emphatically correct. I mean, I thought that John Roberts did a good job here. I mean, you're kind of grasping at straws. There's not a ton of originalist evidence insofar as the founders never contemplated the possibility that we would be in a situation like this. But my reading of the executive power certainly would require some level of criminal immunity that is nothing less than civil immunity. So they had to go at least as far as Nixon versus Fitzgerald. It made a lot of sense to me.
Well said. Our legal eagles will join us on later on in the show. We'll be right back with more here on Jenna Ellis Tonight. My fellow Americans, we are experiencing instability at every level. Our government lacks leadership, and Bidenomics has been an absolute disaster. The economy is in a fragile state. Inflation has been a consistent issue, and high interest rates have put significant pressure on the real estate market. There have been major bank failures, and many analysts say a stock market correction is likely overdue. We have global conflicts in Europe and the Middle East that have the potential to spread, but gold has soared to record highs even amid the tensions. There are so many reasons that Americans just like you and me should consider investments in gold and silver, and Legacy Precious Metals is the gold standard. I love Legacy Precious Metals because of their zero hassle, education first approach. They can help you roll your traditional IRA into a gold IRA or ship metals directly to your house. Go to legacypminvestments.com. That's legacypminvestments.com to download their free gold investing guide. I've read it, and there is so much valuable information there. Friends, now is not the time to roll the dice with your hard-earned money. Find out about the growth potential that gold offers you. Contact Legacy Precious Metals today and tell them that I sent you. Well, the other breaking news out of yesterday was the selection of JD Vance as the vice presidential nominee for the Republican Party and the running mate of President Trump. So let's bring in Carly Atchison, who is a GOP strategist. And Carly, I'm really interested in your reaction because there's been, of course, rallying around the Trump-Vance ticket, but then there's also been some conservatives who are very concerned because there have been a lot of different positions, frankly, that Vance has had over the years, not the least of which has been rhetoric of a never Trumper and someone who, at least in 2019, said that he could never support Donald Trump. Now he finds himself very shortly after that Donald Trump's running mate. So what is your assessment of this choice?
Well, first of all, I want to go on record. I think I said this before on your show that I'm partial to governors being chosen for vice presidential positions just because I think it's the executive branch. I want somebody who can step in on day one. Now, that said, I can get behind a JD Vance pick for a couple reasons. One, undoubtedly, his life story is one that I think is incredibly inspiring. He lived the American dream, and I think right now it's one that the country really needs to hear. This is somebody who grew up in poverty, had nothing handed to them, and decided that he wanted a better life, and he made that happen for himself. His book, Hillbilly Elegy, was really well written. That's an important story and an inspiring one that I think the country really needs to hear right now, whether you're Democrat or Republican. So there's that piece of it. I do think he can be an effective communicator for the states that Republicans need to win. Michigan, Pennsylvania, his home state of Ohio, Wisconsin, where the convention's being held right now. This is a guy who grew up in Appalachia, in the Midwest, and can really speak the language of these people. And look, Donald Trump also has his base there too, but he can't be everywhere all the time. So if you're deploying your deputy JD Vance to go host fundraisers, he can speak the language. He can communicate that agenda to those folks there on the ground, and they're willing to listen right now because they are not happy with Joe Biden. These are even the traditionally Democrat voters in these states, blue collar. That's who JD Vance, that is JD Vance, right? So there's that piece of it. And then I've heard a lot of talk about his youth, his inexperience. I take the opposite view. I think his youth is actually needed in this race. I've heard criticisms of JD Vance's inexperience. He hasn't even finished his first term in the Senate, his age. But I think that's actually a positive. I think our ticket desperately needs somebody who is young, who has energy, he's vibrant. It's great to see a young guy with a beautiful wife, a young family come on to the Republican ticket. I think that's desperately needed. So this is a pick that I can get behind. Despite his comments made in the past, I think that obviously he's on board with the president and the American First agenda. I actually thought when I read his book, Hillbilly Elegy, when it came out, that he gave a voice actually to the forgotten men and women who Trump was talking to. So I think that there's something there. I think the media, Democrat media in particular, is going to pick apart his past statements. But look, I think we're moving forward. He's on the ticket. Let's get behind him and let's win this thing in November.
Yeah, and I think, there's almost every prominent Republican that has said negative things about Trump in the past. It's not like JD Vance said it, 2 days before he's the nominee. I mean, this was back in 2019. He's clearly distanced himself from those remarks. There are a lot of people, even past 2016, presidential candidates that said I think even worse rhetoric than JD Vance that are now Trump's besties. So, I don't think that really ultimately matters. But of course, the left is going to exploit this. What I'm really excited about, Carly, is a debate between JD Vance and Kamala Harris. That is going to look very different than the Harris-Pence debate in 2020, because I think that Vance will bring a lot more fire.
Absolutely. And that was one of my thoughts too when I saw this pick. You have somebody who went to Harvard Law School, served in the military. He is fearless. He is not afraid. And he is way better in terms of articulating an agenda, a vision, just articulating in general, I think, than Kamala Harris. And so I am really looking forward to that debate as well. Generally, those debates in general, and especially for the vice president, don't tend to sway people one way or the other. But what I think is happening right now, especially on the Republican side, if not exclusively on the Republican side, is you're seeing enthusiasm, you're seeing energy, you're seeing excitement. The way President Trump was received was amazing, I thought, yesterday. And for a long time, that's been missing from our party. So it's really good to see kind of like, somebody that people feel like they can get behind. Maybe we're not, going to change people's minds with the debate, but at the same time, we have something to cheer for, something to be excited about. And that goes a long way.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, Carly, JD Vance does represent a new, younger generation. He's 39. He's a millennial. He was born actually just a few months before I was. So, he's definitely right in our age group. And that matters, I think, to the future of the party. Do you think that Vance is being raised up as the candidate for 2028, or is it a little too early to start talking about that?
I think it might be a little too early to start talking about it. I think of course, it's never too early to start thinking about it. So maybe if you're JD Vance, you have a different take on that. But at the same time, I think everybody in our party understands the absolute necessity that we take back the White House this coming November. The idea of 4 more years of a Biden administration, it just would be absolutely detrimental to this country. And so it really feels good that everybody seems to be getting behind and focused on winning this election in November. I'm glad to see, frankly, Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis, who I previously worked for, being invited to the convention, speaking at the convention. That's great because, as I say, we have to remember that we have to defeat Joe Biden. We cannot have another 4 years. It would be detrimental to this country. So it's really good to see everybody uniting, coming together, focusing on the mission, which is winning in November and defeating Joe Biden.
Yeah, and I think that Donald Trump absolutely has so much more momentum, even than he did a few months ago, with some significant wins. Even the dismissal of the documents case out of Florida. He survived an assassination attempt, which was just absolutely horrific. So has a lot of political goodwill in that sense. And so, it surprised a few people that that Donald Trump chose a white man. And how important do you think, if at all, that this ticket being, 2 men and 2 white men actually matters? Of course, the left is going to exploit that. I personally don't even care. I want competent, qualified people, not necessarily, what their identity happens to be.
Yeah, I think identity politics is a loser strategy. It's one that the Democrats play, and it shouldn't be something that we give into as a Republican Party. That's a slippery slope to go down because now you're talking about, to your point, not can you fill the role of vice president, can you do a good job, but what color is your skin? Are you female? It's just kind of one of those things where if we start playing that game, that's a slippery slope, and we're no better than the Democrats. And so I don't think it matters. I think people are so fed up with the state of the economy.
And we're going to have to leave it there. But also, my little dog Copper just wanted to give his input, as you saw in the last couple of slides. So this is Copper, for everybody who doesn't know. We'll be right back with more here in studio on Jenna Ellis Tonight. Well, friends, you might have heard that Mike Lindell and MyPillow no longer have the support of their box stores or shopping channels the way that they used to. They've been part of this cancel culture, so they want to pass along the savings directly to you by having a $25 extravaganza. I love that word, extravaganza. When Mike started MyPillow, it was just a one-product company. With the help of his dedicated employees, they now have hundreds of products, some you may not even know about. To get the word out, I want to invite my listeners to check out their $25 extravaganza. 2-pack multi-use MyPillows are just $25. MyPillow sandals, also awesome, only $25. Their 6-pack towel sets are $25. And brand new 4-pack dish towels, you guessed it, just $25. For the first time ever, the premium MyPillows with the all-new Giza fabric, just $25. And orders over $75 will receive free shipping, too. This amazing offer won't last long. Go to mypillow.com, use the promo code Jenna, or call 800-564
800-564-8475 today. That's 800-564-8475, or go to mypillow.com and use the promo code Jenna.
Well, as the RNC convention got well underway last night with the presidential and vice presidential nominations of Donald Trump and JD Vance, there were some conservatives that were very concerned about the direction of the platform still, and also the party. So the log cabin Republicans, who of course stand for LGBTQ agenda, said this in a letter after the platform was posted and actually affirmed. Said the quote, "The approval today of the 2024 Republican Party platform at the Republican National Convention is an historic moment for both the GOP and for our country. Log cabin Republicans have been working for decades to help build a more inclusive GOP and update the platform's outdated and out-of-step language opposing marriage equality, an issue that the vast majority of the country and a majority of Republican voters support. Today, that hard work has finally come to fruition. The platform sends a powerful message to LGBTQ conservatives across the country that we are not only welcome in the Republican Party, but a part of the movement to make America great again. It also makes clear to voters that the Republican Party welcomes all and is looking optimistically to the future instead of cynically rehashing old debates of the past. This is a platform of unity. We applaud President Trump for his visionary, inclusive, and consistent leadership, without which this moment wouldn't be possible. LGBT conservatives are more determined than ever before to help the GOP fight the gender ideology of the Democrat Party, and more enthused than ever to nominate President Trump as our standard bearer and make America great again." Let's bring in Jon Root, who is a cultural and sports commentator. So, Jon, this is not great for conservatives or Republicans. I'm left wondering, what does the log cabin Republicans think that they object to in the Democrats' extremist gender-affirming ideology that they don't support?
Well, again, we got to know that the Republican Party and conservatism as we know it right now is moving to the left. The Overton window has shifted. So what we're now calling conservative is probably about 20 years ago would be considered Democrat. And then we're seeing now that Trump is leading the charge for this Republican view of inclusivity. So the Democrats, they can't define what a woman is. Republicans can't define what a marriage is. Both parties are saying abortion's fine. Republicans say to some extent. Democrats are saying pretty much all the way to 9 months. And then at this point, too, we have to understand that we don't have a fear of the Lord. What's the beginning of wisdom? It's the fear of the Lord. We have more of a fear of man than we do of God. God defined marriage in Genesis. Jesus, God in the flesh, made sure he doubled down on that as you read in Matthew. Have you not read? So we don't get to change these things because times have changed. And it's a slap in the face to God. It's a slap in the face to our foundation.
Yeah. And, I was just responding on social media this morning to some user that said, well, God spared President Trump. He spared his life. I mean, make no mistake, I agree with that. But then said, so, we have to now support this party. And I'm thinking, well, just because God intervened miraculously, are you suggesting that God also intends for Christians to completely discount what his word has stood for the last 6,000 years? I mean, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So, Jon, in your view, where does this lead and leave Christian conservatives?
I'm going to read this real quick because I know we only have so much time. When Eric Trump sat down with NBC News yesterday, they said the Republican platform no longer calls for a federal abortion ban, no longer defines marriage between one man and one woman. Is this a sign Donald Trump is moving to the center? And he said, my father's always been there on these issues. That's reflective of my father and what he believes in, and my wife, Laura. And then he goes on to say this country has holes in the roof, and we've got to fix those holes and stop worrying about the spot on the wall. If he believes that child murder is just a spot on the wall, me as a Christian, I've said, I don't believe there's any justification to vote for a Democrat or support the Democrat Party. Now the Republicans are saying, let me test that theory with Christians and try to toe the line a little bit to see where you guys are going to go now. It's not Christian. We're living in a godless nation. We're living in a post-Christian nation. And we need to fight back. We're down 3-0 in a 7-game series, and we need to fight back. We need to pray for Trump. We need to pray for people like Amber Rose. We need to pray for the lady that did the Sikh prayer. We need to come to Christ, and we need to serve him.
Yeah, well said. A lot to think about. We'll be right back with more. Well, all eyes have been on the RNC convention this week. The National Conservatism Convention was held last week and had some very important discussions about not only the future of America, but also our past and our legal jurisprudence. So Josh Hammer had a wonderful speech at NatCon. Here is just a little bit of that.
In the 1947 case of Everson versus Board of Education, the U.S. Supreme Court, for the very first time, interpreted the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which states that, quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion as effectuating a, quote, wall of separation between church and state. Justice Hugo Black's majority opinion in Everson thus resuscitated this hitherto obscure 233-word letter, aka a tweet, as my co-panelist said, by then-President Thomas Jefferson to the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut, in which the nation's third president used that precise phrase. Never mind that Jefferson's pithy and unremarkable letter was penned in a distinctly political context. He was trying to make inroads among the New England clergy, which at that time was more partial to the rival Federalist Party of John Adams, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and so forth. Never mind that the Jeffersonian conception of a so-called wall of separation between church and state has no textual, contextual, or historical basis whatsoever in the actual words or meaning of the First Amendment. Never mind that Jefferson himself personally was gallivanting off in revolutionary France during the debate over the very ratification of the Bill of Rights. The liberal misnomer of so-called separation of church and state soon ossified into a core tenet of America's post-war civic experience and a touchstone of the Supreme Court's First Amendment jurisprudence, and was all based on a tragic lie. As Justice William Rehnquist explained in his blistering dissent in the 1985 case Wallace versus Jaffrey, Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist Association was a short note of courtesy, written 14 years after the amendments were passed by Congress. He would seem to any detached observer as a less than ideal source of contemporary history as to the meaning of the religion clauses of the First Amendment. But so-called separationism is not merely wrong as a constitutional matter. It has also led to results that are both ludicrous and tragic.
Let's bring back in our legal eagles to discuss. And we're back with Josh Hammer and Mike Donnelly. So Josh, a really great speech. I would encourage everyone to go and watch the full speech. But let's talk about this whole idea and the lie, as you rightly put it, of separation of church and state, because I'm seeing even those on the so-called populist right having this whole idea and promulgating the idea that government shouldn't legislate morality and that nowhere does religion infiltrate government. It just is a lie.
Well, Jenna, first of all, I appreciate you playing the speech here on the show. That's very generous of you. You know, a shameless plug, if I may. I'm actually incorporating that speech into the final chapter of my forthcoming book, which comes out next year. The book will be called Israel and Civilization, and the final chapter of the book is calling for a Jewish-Christian alliance to save the West. And that speech is going to be incorporated into the final chapter. But, you know, in any event, to your question, it was actually just a few paragraphs after that I kind of referenced in the speech. You know, there was actually a separate speech that then Senator from Illinois, Barack Obama, actually gave in 2006. This is probably the only time that I have ever favorably cited Barack Obama in my entire life. He gave a speech at some sort of prayer breakfast, I think it was. And what he basically said was that those who tell people of faith, those who tell religious people, Jews, Christians alike, that they cannot bring their morality, they cannot bring their principles, they cannot bring biblical teachings, you know, into the public square, they are wrong. And what Barack Obama actually says, you know, is that the law is kind of by definition a codification of morality, much of it in the Anglo-American context being a codification of Judeo-Christian morality. Again, that's not me, that's coming from Barack Obama. But, you know, the notion of so-called separation of church and state, it's ludicrous, not just for the legal and historical reasons that I mentioned there. The current jurisprudence is also wildly hypocritical. So, you know, Jenna, consider the fact that the U.S. Supreme Court today, in the actual courtroom, they have a frieze on the wall of Moses holding the tablets at Mount Sinai. However, you know, if some random school in the middle of the country wants to put that in their classroom, it's immediately deemed to be constitutionally suspect. So why can the Supreme Court do it, but a random school or parish or whatnot in the middle of the country cannot do so as well? But more generally, it has had tragic cultural downstream effects where people of faith, Christians and Jews alike, are basically told, shut up, you bigot. You can't actually kind of live your life in the public square as a believer in God, Scripture, and Bible, and so forth there. So this is a horrible case, this 1947 Everson versus Board of Education case. And then in a law review article next year that I co-authored with Yoram Hazony, who's kind of the de facto king, if you will, of the NatCon movement, as well as my co-panelists on that panel, Time and Klein, the three of us have a co-authored law review article coming out in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy saying that the conservative legal movement now in a post-Roe world should really kind of unify around overturning this Everson case as kind of our next big goal.
I think that's absolutely precision, and it does need to be our next big goal. And so, Mike, I know that you have taught a lot on this. You and I have ranted privately and publicly about this lie of separation of church and state. And to Josh's point, it is a legal absurdity when you see the practical effects of having, a Supreme Court that clearly understands the divine lawgiver and the lawgivers in our past that are Judeo and Christian in nature. And yet somehow we've bought into this secular sacred split in our society where the left has absolutely no problem bringing their religion, their Marxist cultural communism into the public square every day. So to Josh's point, do you think that the Supreme Court could potentially once and for all overrule this and actually give a good exposition or exegesis on the First Amendment?
Well, Lemon is gone, and that was one of the worst things that was used by the courts to impose this secularism, so to speak, on us, which was never intended by the Constitution. One of the founders, John Adams, said, "Our Constitution is made for a wholly religious and moral people. It's inadequate to govern any other." And when you look around, you see why he said that. Law is inherently an expression of morality, and that's a conversation we are having right now in this country over issues of sexuality, marriage, gender. These are important matters that are founded on people's deeply held religious convictions. I'm not a fan of incorporation, and I'd love to point people to the Federalist Society. There was an article written recently by a lawyer, Frederick Claybook, that calls for the disincorporation of the Establishment Clause. I'm not a fan of the incorporation doctrine. I think it's wrong. What it has resulted in is a federalization of rights jurisprudence, which was never intended by the founders. In 1833, the court said the Bill of Rights does not apply to the states. But the 14th Amendment opened the door, and then the court walked through it decades later, selectively incorporating year over year different sections of the Bill of Rights to apply to the states, and then creating these tests that would apply on a national basis. That was never what the founders intended. The founders respected dual sovereignty, where the states are sovereigns and get to make decisions for themselves. The Bill of Rights was meant to apply mostly to the federal government. So I'm glad we're having this conversation. I love Josh's speech, and this is exciting for me to see that judges and commentators are having this conversation, that someone actually wrote an article calling for the disestablishment of the incorporation of the First Amendment as it relates to religion.
Yeah, and Josh, to Mike's point as well on the incorporation and basically a civil rights focus rather than a property rights focus in America. I think that we've lost our way jurisprudentially on that front as well. Is there an opportunity here, especially in a second Trump administration, to get even more federal judges and perhaps Supreme Court nominees that are willing to go beyond Roe and address some of these very important jurisprudential concerns?
Yeah, so let me just quickly touch on the incorporation thing, and then I'll answer your question, Jenna. So I agree with Mike that incorporation doctrine, by which we mean the idea that the Bill of Rights applies to states. So I also think that it's wrong. And it was actually Elon Werman, an Arizona State young law professor, who has a recent law review article trying to revive this argument. Most of kind of even the originalist legal academy are really not fans of this. Elon's trying to revive it. So good luck, and I hope that it's successful. But even if we incorporate the individual rights in the Bill of Rights, so free speech, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, the Establishment Clause is not an individual right. It's literally there as a federalism provision. Philip Hamburger has demonstrated this. Clarence Thomas has said that too. So even if, conceding for the sake of argument, you incorporate the individual rights, you still should not incorporate the Establishment Clause. Now,
And Josh, we're going to have to take a quick pause there, and then we'll come right back with the rest of that response with our Legal Eagle panel right after this. My fellow Americans, we are experiencing instability at every level. Our government lacks leadership, and Bidenomics has been an absolute disaster. The economy is in a fragile state. Inflation has been a consistent issue, and high interest rates have put significant pressure on the real estate market. There have been major bank failures, and many analysts say a stock market correction is likely overdue. We have global conflicts in Europe and the Middle East that have the potential to spread, but gold has soared to record highs even amid the tensions. There are so many reasons that Americans just like you and me should consider investments in gold and silver, and Legacy Precious Metals is the gold standard. I love Legacy Precious Metals because of their zero hassle, education first approach. They can help you roll your traditional IRA into a gold IRA or ship metals directly to your house. Go to legacypminvestments.com. That's legacypminvestments.com to download their free gold investing guide. I've read it, and there is so much valuable information there. Friends, now is not the time to roll the dice with your hard-earned money. Find out about the growth potential that gold offers you. Contact Legacy Precious Metals today and tell them that I sent you. And we're back with our Legal Eagles to continue discussing how we build back better to a society that actually respects the rule of law and our original Constitution. So, Josh, for the break, you were going to answer the rest of the question between, civil rights versus property rights.
Yeah, well, Jenny, you had actually also asked me about judicial nominees in a second Trump term and kind of how we go about, further kind of pushing the judiciary towards a more constitutionalist direction more generally. So I actually just wrote a recent column on this because, conservatives tend to really just focus on the cases, where, our side, so to speak, wins. But if you look closely, there still actually are a lot of cases where our side falls short. And I've been a critic of judicial nominees from the right for actually a very long time now. So, some things that I would personally encourage the next Trump administration and their outside allies to look for when it comes to judicial nominees. So the very first thing that you need to do is actually do the reading and do a deep dive and very, very carefully vet the nominee. So to kind of just give one example, Neil Gorsuch, who generally is a good justice. He certainly reaches the right outcome far more often than not, but he has some bad mess ups. And he had the Bostock case in 2020 where he read sexual orientation and transgenderism into Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. If you had actually done the reading, you would have seen that he had a 2009 case called Castle where he did exactly that. So do the reading, look at the history, and make sure that every nominee who gets promoted has an undeniable track record of full spectrum across the board conservatism on all of the cultural issues, the administrative state issues, you name it. The second one is you have to have an eagerness and a willingness to correct course. You can't just have this kind of very cautious incrementalist approach. We see this with Amy Coney Barrett, unfortunately. She's here at the Supreme Court, and she seems to be always looking for excuses to not do something. She seems to be always looking for an excuse to not find standing or to dig a case, to dismiss it as improvidently granted, or to not grant cert in a high-profile charge segmented case. You have to actually have a willingness to course correct when it comes to granting cert, when it comes to standing, things like that there. So you just have to be generally a little more aggressive in your posture there. And the final thing that I would briefly add is I get a lot of flack for saying this, but I'll say it anyway. You actually have to look at the person's private life. I actually care a lot where that person goes to church or synagogue. If you go to a church or synagogue that's flying a rainbow flag, you cannot be promoted. You shouldn't be on the federal bench in the first place. You should go to a theologically conservative house of worship, and you should live in a family where your wife or your husband is also a conservative. Because if your wife or husband is someone who does not agree with you politically, well, you're probably going to have some days where you're feeling that pressure at the proverbial breakfast table, and you might wobble on a very important case.
Mike, your thoughts on a second Trump administration and what should be our vetting process for federal judicial appointees?
Well, I think Josh, get Josh Hammer involved and make him in charge. Maybe that would be helpful. I think I have confidence in Josh's selection criteria. I mean, Trump has put out lists. He's going to add to those lists. I think he's got some good people on those lists. I mean, we've made so many mistakes in the conservative movement over the years. Souter, Kennedy, disasters. Utter disasters on the Supreme Court, and we have to do better. I think Trump has done better than some of his predecessors with Gorsuch and Barrett and Kavanaugh, and more Justice Clarence Thomases. I mean, people who are willing to actually look at the Constitution and apply the Constitution. Judges like Aileen Cannon, who will interpret the statute and say, no, this is Congress's job. They haven't done it. So, Trump is going to do a lot better than we've done in the past, I think, if his track record holds. And if I'm encouraged. We are in a big battle in this country over the direction of our country. And I'm encouraged by some of the things I'm seeing, but there's a lot of work to be done. We're taking baby steps here.
Yeah, and I would agree with both of you that it can't be just an incremental approach. I mean, there has to be a willingness on the judiciary and also in the two political branches, the political will to actually advance the cause of conservatism. And so, Josh, while FedSoc Leonard Leo has maybe fallen a little bit out of favor with Trump, but you never really know. I mean, he's brought back people. I mean, look at JD Vance, who was once a never Trumper, and he's now the running mate, right? So who are some of the organizations that you think will be leading the way to at least advise President Trump? I mean, we've seen the left just absolute hysteria over Project 2025, which I think is hilarious.
Yeah. So look, I've been a Federal Society campus speaker for years now, and a fairly frequent one at that. So I'm certainly not going to speak poorly of the Federal Society, but it's a large organization. There are certain individuals who have their views one way or the other, and I have my views, and I would selfishly hope that the Trump White House counsel's office will listen to those inside of the Federal Society and other organizations whose views more closely mirror my own. Certainly, Project 2025, the Heritage Foundation, good place to look as well. America First Legal. There's any number of organizations, but there's also any number of individuals out there as well. And again, it's even more so than the organizations, Jenna, it's the ideas. It's the actual criteria that we should be looking for. And I really hope that those are promoted and that some lessons from the past have hopefully been learned moving forward as well.
Yeah, well, Legal Eagles, always really appreciate your insights. And there's so much more that we can philosophize about. And this is why I love having these conversations on there, because it's not just about Republican versus Democrat. It is about the idea of the American experiment and our path forward. I'll see you tomorrow night.